Good evening, everyone. I'm going to start this evening's event, and I'd like to welcome everyone to the Courtauld Institute of Art. My name is Maria Mileeva, and I'm a lecturer here teaching Russian, Soviet, and post-Soviet art. And it's really wonderful to see so many of you here, including my students from many years before, as well as current students. So thank you all for coming. And we are all here to celebrate the launch of Christina Kiaer's book that we will be discussing today. And the book is here, Collective Body, Aleksandr Deineka at the Limit of Socialist Realism. And there will be copies of the book here for you to look at, but unfortunately there are no books for sale. However, we have these wonderful leaflets around, as well as here on the table, that if you pick it up, there is a 30% discount code that I really encourage you to pick that up and purchase the book in your own time. So my role today is really to chair the discussion and officiate the proceedings and events. We have a busy day. The event is organized by the Courtauld Institute of Art, as well as Fringe Center for the Study of Social and Cultural Complexity at UCL, and PPV, Perverting the Power, Vertical Politics and Aesthetics, which is a seminar group that is also based at School of Slavonic Studies at UCL. And I'm going to make short introductions, and I will then hand over. I'm going to kind of explain how this evening's event will run. I will make short introductions, and then we'll have some presentations followed by a discussion with our eminent discussants, and then we will have an opportunity to have questions from the audience, so please prepare your questions. There will be a roving mic. The event is being recorded, so please speak in the mic so that can also be uploaded. And afterwards, one of the other important things I want to say, there is a drinks reception, so which is going to be in the research forum as you exit on the right, so stay behind for the reception. If you need bathrooms, I know that some of you are looking at it, some practical information. There's some bathrooms on the top floor and the floor below as well, so you can easily find those. And I would just like to use this opportunity to thank the research forum, Sophie, who is here to help us, as well as Diego for bringing us all together. So I'd like to do short introductions and encourage you to look at the biographies online in the order that we will speak. So Christina Kiaer will speak first and will present the book to you for about 15 to 20 minutes. And Christina is the Francis Hooper Professor in Arts and Humanities and Chair of the Department of Art History in Northwestern University. So we're really delighted to have you here with us today from US. Alex Potts will speak next, making short remarks and a presentation. And Alex Potts is Professor Emeritus of University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. We will then move to the table, and we will have short remarks from Professor Sarah Wilson, who is a professor in contemporary art here at the Courtauld, followed by Michał Murawski, who is the Associate Professor at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies at UCL. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Christina.
Hello everyone, and thank you so much for coming out. I want to do some thanks as well. I mean, of course, to the Courtauld for hosting the Fringe Center, is it? And the PPV. And mostly I want to thank Maria Mileeva for organizing this event and for being such a great interlocutor about socialist realism over many years. I'm so glad to have you as a colleague in the field. And also to Sarah Wilson, who spoke Picasso Marx was a big influence on me. To Michał Murawski, a friend and whose kind of punk attitude toward Soviet culture has been very liberating for me. And of course also his important books and so on. And Alex Potts, who has been an art historian that I've been in dialogue with for many years, thinking outside of the Soviet Union and really into modernism more broadly and the question of realism and socialist art. So for me, it's kind of a dream team, and I'm so glad to have everyone here, of course, also in the audience. The book Collective Body is about, it's sort of my bid to try to give an account of socialist realism. I started it literally decades ago, very prematurely, before I'd finished my first book, but I got very excited about it. And at the time I started thinking about socialist realism, most other people were not. It was just something that nobody was interested in. It was a kind of a negative category that if we ever heard about it in my studies, it was simply an image thrown up as a negative comparison. Like, look at this bad thing, as opposed to the important modernism that was going on elsewhere. And I have a PowerPoint, so I should show it. So my first monograph about Soviet art was called Imagine No Possessions, and it was about Russian constructivism, which everybody loved. Everybody loved the avant-garde, they still do. Well, except for, I will say more about this later. Of course, right now, the question of love for Russian and Soviet art is obviously a very difficult one, and it's not a topic that is readily appreciated because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But at the time that I wrote it, the avant-garde was the topic that everyone was interested in. But as I did the research on that book, I began, in the archives, in Soviet journals, in museums, I began to see that this negative category of socialist realism, everything that came after 1932, was actually a lot more interesting than I had thought it was. And so that was when my interest in this project began. And I ended up choosing Aleksandr Deineka as the kind of case study through which I would follow the unfolding story of the development of socialist realism. And in the interest of time, I won't say anything about the other works that are on the screen, but the other books that are on the screen. But what the main argument of the book is that socialist realism is not a totalitarian style. It doesn't tell us what things look like, but that it is rather a collective system of art making. And it's that system that I try to explicate in the book through the figure of a single person. So here's Aleksandr Deineka, young and older, in a very flattering self-portrait made in 1948. And a lot of people have said, why are you writing a monograph? That's a really outmoded form in art history. We don't do that anymore. And my answer is that because socialist realism has always been seen as this totalitarian form, and that the artists within socialist realism are seen to be simply cogs in a system. There are directives from Stalin in this narrative, which is nonsense. Stalin didn't care much about painting and certainly wasn't telling painters what to do. But the idea is that there are directives from above and the painters all fall into line and they simply do what they're told in a kind of structuralist sense. And so I thought that by focusing on one person and following them through their kind of history and their relations to everyone else, and also through their pictures, it was a way of pushing against that totalitarian model. And I originally chose Deineka because I liked his paintings. Especially with my modernist training, he looked good to me, whereas other artists, I couldn't see them because it was trained as a modernist, I was so horrified by the other socialist realist paintings. I no longer am as much. But I thought that I would indulge in just reading like 3 paragraphs from the introduction, just because this is a book and not just a set of ideas. And so I thought that you could just hear a little bit about what I had to say. So this is from the very beginning of the introduction, where I talk about the young Deineka, who was 19 at this time. The young Deineka bubbled over with revolutionary affect when he addressed the Art Workers' Union Day in Kursk in August 1918. So Kursk is a provincial city in the south of Russia, close to the Ukrainian border where he's from. Quote, "Who isn't captivated by our time? Who can remain indifferent to it? I want to sketch the bright surges and titanic sweep of the proletariat in sun-drenched colors with thousands of semi-precious stones and capture this heroic battle of the proletarian masses," end quote. Bolshevik language of heroic battle and proletarian masses combines with fairy tale images of proletarian giants and glinting treasure. The artistic freedom of the avant-garde's revolt against academic art. We are young like spring, like our freedom. We see freedom, it is ours, and this is why I deeply believe in the great art of our days. So this revolt against academic art intertwines ecstatically with the political freedom of the proletarian collective, whose power has been unleashed by revolution. So another quote, "I want to speak in sunny ways about art, about the beauty of art, about the aspect of our life that floats before the gaze in a dream of lines and colors under the hum of creative work, under the clanking and whistling of machines. With childlike purity, the artist collective must speak of itself in paint, must incarnate its feelings in the temples of modernity," end quote. In the rhythmic forward flow of his words, visual evocations, lines and colors, combine with oral ones, clanking and whistling, and positional phrases, before the gaze, under the hum, to conjure the haptic aesthetic sensations that incarnate the artist collective's spike in joyful feeling. The new art turns up the intensive register to reconnect the larger proletarian collective to itself and the world it is building. The transformative power of the new art takes on a magical aspect as Deineka's incantational speech builds towards its conclusion. Quote, "You see, these are fairy tales of the proletariat, creating its bright life. Look thoughtfully into the souls of these pictures, and you will see how vividly and powerfully they express everything that the proletariat is creating and building. We have fallen in love with our time and our art. This is our life and the great, powerfully creative principle of our laboring people. Our shared great work is in the collective, the collectif, even to the detriment of the individual personality, but to the greater achievement of the whole," end quote. In Deineka's fairy tale of revolution, the new pictures have proletarian souls, and we fall in love with them. Not a private love born of subjective emotions and individual identities, but an impersonal force that connects us to the collective, even to the detriment of the individual personality. Yes, this is the unruly speech of a 19-year-old provincial, and its heedless forward surge could be described as blithe and unlettered rather than incantational. The proletariat is mythic, the power differentials between members of the collective not yet under scrutiny. Yet the unforced euphoric lines capture the fervor of political and aesthetic revolution that seized the young Deineka in Kursk, and collective body will endeavor to hold on to this fervor as it proceeds to look thoughtfully at Deineka's more sober production over the following decades. Decades that would, it hardly needs saying, break the spell of the fairy tale of revolution. Graduating from floating childlike visions of unfettered freedom, our thoughts must be pure, pure and beautiful. They must be bright and rainbow-like, sunny like freedom. He would soon enough get down to building a new art system that would laterally distribute the power to decide what the great shared work of the collective should look like and what degree of detriment individuals should accept in the service of the whole. In their souls, his pictures, presenting a seemingly limitless surge of grand proletarian bodies, would become more organized, harnessing the hum and flow of affective forces released by revolution into a rigorous aesthetic system. So that's enough of me reading at you. But the book proceeds from this moment of this ecstatic embrace of revolution, and as I say, begins to take a more sober look at what would happen afterwards. So I begin with just two key images from the book, from chapter 1 and chapter 6, which is sort of the culminating chapter. And we have on the left his illustration of a magazine that I spend a lot of time with, Bezbožník u stanka, Atheist at the Workbench. And it shows, it is an image, a rare image of the actual dictatorship of the proletariat. It's a very abstract concept, so not a lot of artists try to depict it. And it's in some ways, it's an extremely discursive image, and I'll say more about that in a moment. It's illustrating a very short report at the bottom from a worker at a factory who's telling the story to the readers of this magazine about his factory and how there are 47 workers at his factory who are now delegates working at various governmental institutions of the new Soviet state. This is in 1925. So all the words and letters and acronyms below the figures show which organizations they have been deputized to. So it really shows them emerging from the factory, this hand coming out of the factory, going out and actually being the dictators. They're the proletariat, and they are now the government of the dictatorship of the proletariat. And the obvious reading of this in an anti-Soviet sense would be, yes, look at the hand that's controlling all the proletariat like puppets on strings. And I'm trying to push back against that and saying that rather they represent a kind of force field, and that's a term I take from Walter Benjamin, writing about his visit to Moscow famously in 1926-27, and that it's really the factory as a source of power, the labor as a source of power, that then allows them all to emerge and go out and be in this kind of intensely energized force field where they all occupy different spaces. And as I also argue in the first chapter, I claim that Deineka was actually the person who invented the image of the proletarian body, that there wasn't one really existing in Russia before this. There wasn't an iconography of the laboring body, and that here in miniature we kind of see his laboring bodies always kind of poised, like with bent elbows and knees, like full of energy, ready to go. So when I mentioned discursivity, that's one of the main arguments of the book, is that socialist realism is usually seen as an extremely discursive phenomenon. The important scholar Aleksandr Deineka has written really powerfully about this, that it's a system of words, of language, of directives, and then people responding, people talking, critics, the masses, that it's all a lot, like it's an extremely discursive phenomenon. I don't contest that, but I do say at the same time, what happens if we look at the pictures themselves, if we allow the visual to have a different valence from the discursive, and how they actually kind of push at that discursive box of socialist realism, and I argue exceed it. So we have the discursive thing, this worker making a report, but then we have an image that I think takes his report about the 47 workers and really gives us something different and visual, and something that can be read in all kinds of different ways beyond that discursivity. And then the image on the right, which is my cover image, is called Na ženskom sabrani, at the women's meeting. It's from 1937, so we've gone way forward in time to the Stalinist terror. And one of my arguments about this work is that it is specifically anti-discursive, that this is the moment of denunciations, of the show trials, of constant conversation about wreckers and trials, executions, and so on. Images of Stalin, images of Lenin, people looking up to them through lines of sight, as has been argued by another important colleague in the field, Susan Reed. And here in Deineka's image, they're all just kind of looking at each other, looking past each other. It's conversational, and it's hushed. It's quiet. And I see this as a specific response to, and I actually bring, it's a Freudian reading, a kind of, that I'm not arguing that it's fully conscious, but a response that pushes back against the noise of the terror and specifically disavows all of that in favor of this very different kind of image. And it looks utterly unlike any other images from the exhibition where it was first shown and from other socialist realist images at this time. And one more point, one of the key points is I'm using the concept of laterality. It's not mine, others have used it. But this idea of an art system that the artists, critics, and art historians are all building together, and that they occupy different places in this force field of the new Soviet system that's being built, and that they're all building it together. Of course, there are certain directives from above, but mostly they're all muddling through and trying to figure out what should this look like. And then the move that I make visually is that this laterality is in fact also figured literally in Deineka's images with these lateral lines spreading out. Often his figures are arranged in these frieze-like rows, that there's a kind of literalization of this laterality. And I'm trying to think if there was, no, I think that's all I wanted to say. And then I'll just show you just very briefly about the chapters. So chapter 1 is called the proletarian body, this idea of inventing an imagery of the proletarian body. The image on the left is not by Deineka, it's a cover of Atheist at the Workbench by Dmitry Maor, an important graphic artist who was a colleague of Deineka's, with a kind of very decadent looking Christ talking to the fat capitalists in their top hats and saying that he's ready to serve them because it's very anti-religious, obviously. And then the right picture is called a riddle picture. Which one of these is the atheist? Any guesses? No? Is it so? Which is the woman on the right the atheist? Yes, exactly. So you get it. I won't go into too much more detail, but here but this is an image that I use also to talk about how Deineka. So he's born in 1899. He goes to Vchutemas, the very well-known art school in Moscow where the avant-garde artists taught. But he didn't study with the avant-gardists. He studied in the graphics faculty, which was seen as more traditional. But he was in the constructivist orbit, and he was very friendly with Mayakovsky. And so it's also an argument here about how I don't want to separate the avant-garde so completely from the non-avant-garde, as art history has tended to do, that the history of this period is all about the avant-garde with a few other bad artists sort of doing something over here. But that's of course not how it was. It was this very active field, and the constructivists were actually an important but modest corner of that force field, one could say. And so this image, I argue, could easily illustrate one of Sergei Tretyakov's many articles in NEF about NEF, the new economic policy, and the fat, blousy Netmanka, this woman, you know, with her flapper dress and her hat and so on, that even though he's doing realistic or figurative imagery, which the constructivists refused, they're part of the same conversation. And in fact, the constructivists liked mass graphic art because that fit with their political concerns. And so, for example, I also think a little bit about Lyubov Popova and Varvara Stepanova, the female constructivists who did clothing design and textile design in relation, you know, sort of as occupying corners of this force field. In chapter 2, I take on his major paintings that he's best known for. If anyone saw the Royal Academy exhibition in 2017, then not this painting, but this painting on the left was there. And I'm sorry, the PowerPoint has rearranged my text, so some of it's disappearing. But these are 2 epigraphs from the chapter. All of his pictures could be called Building New Factories, which is the name of this. So it's this critic admiring him, that it's always about construction and building. And then Yekaterina Zirnova saying they justly called him the Mayakovsky of painting. So that's a kind of moment, a quote from the time that connects him to the constructivist orbit. And he made these very large-scale canvases that were extremely successful. And I kind of tried to tease out both their connections to constructivism and the avant-garde, and also the way in which they were conceived specifically against constructivism's rejection of painting. Deineka and his group Ost, the Society of Easel Painters, saying, no, the rejection of painting is wrong-headed. You can be a socialist artist and use oil paint, which goes directly against Liev. Chapter 3 is, I try to offer a new account of the group called October, which is often seen as the grouping. It came together in 1928, that's seen as the last stand of the avant-garde. And I argue that it's perhaps better seen not so much as the last stand of the avant-garde, but as a dress rehearsal for socialist realism. And I'm showing you here 4 covers of the journal Dayosh, which was one of the publications, not officially of October, but basically everyone in the journal was a member of October. And it was a grouping of ex-constructivists, productionist artists, and critics, and art historians. And they had Deineka in the group. Because of his kind of productionist stance, he wasn't making pots and pans and objects, but he was known as this mass illustrator, even though he was also known as a very successful oil painter by this time, although he really only made like 4 big oil paintings all throughout the 1920s. And Deineka here is on the lower left. Orochenko, we're all familiar with his photography, is on the upper left. But unfortunately, 6 issues in, Deineka got the boot. Because I think Orochenko said, no, we're not going to have this figurative guy. We're going to just have photography and caricature. This is an image I adore that I found in the journal Art to the Masses, Искусство в массы. And it's literally showing caricatures of 4 different artist groups at the time that were all fighting with each other. And there was a move to try to bring them together into a federation in 1930 by artists and critics themselves. And they were kind of squished into a federation, but it didn't work out very well. And the famous April 1932 decree where the Central Committee dissolved all artistic groups, that was sort of like the Central Committee coming in and saying, all right, you tried to make a federation, it didn't work, now everybody has to be in one artists union. Even though that decree was specifically aimed at writers, and then everybody else got kind of shuffled into it. And that's just an installation view of the exhibition. October held 1 exhibition, and Deineka had some paintings in it. And in a typical example of how things worked, his paintings were on a wall that said, for discussional purposes. So October was already saying, yeah, no, the whole painting thing is becoming problematic. So you can have a few paintings, but we're not supporting them. They just get to be here. And he had kind of stopped painting when he joined October. So his paintings were a kind of a weird little collection of some random things that he had lying around. Chapter 4 is called Lyrical Socialist Realism. And it's one of the more familiar things I've written because I published it as an article 10 years ago now. This epigraph is important to me. Deineka's type of woman is a successful attempt to find an image of a woman worker who is beautiful in a new way, in our way. And I'm very interested in this idea of a new kind of beauty, which Nikolai Shokotov, this critic, specifically is saying, yes, there are nude bodies here, but they're not the objectified bodies of Western art. This is not Renoir, he says specifically, not the piquant eroticism of Renoir. And I try to explore what would it mean to have these athletic, sort of super Soviet women who are nude, and how does it scramble our ideas about objectification, about pleasure in looking, and so on. And the word lyrical was one that the critics used. It's not me. They called it lyrism, and everyone referred to the paintings that he showed in this big exhibition in 1932 to 33 as lyrical. And I connect it to lyrical film. I show the model, who was the model for all of his lyrical paintings, Lucia Ftorova, who was a champion swimmer. These are photographs from her family album because I got to meet her sister, who was then in her early 90s. who was also a champion swimmer. And then the way in which this visual language then extended into a broader public imagery of the poster and his quite well-known Fiskultura poster here. Chapter 5, I follow him to the United States, where he went to accompany an exhibition of Soviet art, the first in the US, because the US did not diplomatically recognize the Soviet Union until 1933, and it opened in 1934 in Philadelphia. And I just love this Philadelphia newspaper. There's an image of one of Deineka's mural sketches for the Narkomzem building, the Commissariat of Agriculture. And you can see the headline above it. It says, "Not such very revolutionary art after all." So the American critics loved the Soviet show because they're like, oh, we thought there was going to be Lenin and Stalin and, you know, kind of flag waving, but really it looks very familiar. One critic says, this could have been made by the Engineers Club of Baltimore, which is kind of weird, but apparently they had an art group. And then I show on the right his painting, Boredom, of a kind of obviously a bourgeois woman in a very lovely home filled with art. And this is one of the moments of detective work in my book. I was able to track down the home and find out who she was. And the home looks exactly like that to this day. They haven't changed a thing, with the piano and the sculpture and the curtains and the carpeting and that chair. These are two installation shots of the big exhibition he had in 1935 when he returned. He had his first solo exhibition, and he was heralded as this was a way forward for this new thing that they were still figuring out called socialist realism, which was first, the phrase was first used in 1932, and then quite famously made the law of the land, as it were, in 1934. And then also, this is a painting, I'm sorry, the caption got cut off, called Negro Youth. And this is a subsection of this chapter about Deineka's images of Harlem and how he made lots of sketches in Harlem, and when he got back to the US, made several of them into big oil paintings for this exhibition because he was very well aware of the very powerful discourse of anti-racism in the Soviet Union at this time, and especially the obsession with African Americans. And so I think it's somewhat opportunistic, but he made these really quite extraordinary images that I connect to other kinds of imagery. And then the culminating chapter is called Primal Scenes of Socialist Realism, concentrating on his two major commissions from 1937. The one on the left, Illustrious People of the Land of the Soviets, was shown in Paris in 1937 at the very well-known international exhibition. I connected to Guernica and tried to think about how can we think about two major mural-sized modern monuments in 1937 kind of in relation to each other. And then this painting on the right, which was shown in a much more local Moscow exhibition, a 1937 exhibition celebrating 20 years of the Soviet Union, or 20 years since the revolution. But the exhibition was delayed until 1939 because of the terror, and the commissar was repressed and people were killed who were in the paintings and had to be painted out. So now we get into like the true horror of the terror. And that's, again, where this bright light, jewel-like image of incredible, hushed quiet is, I read it as a kind of a primal scene, literally in the Freudian sense, the little boy watching his parents and repressing it all into the scene of white wolves with bushy tails who are completely quiet. It's my only Freudian moment, but it's a doozy, I think. And I end the chapter with this poster, a Fiskultura poster from 1939, bizarrely different from that woman who's spinning and so free and kind of in movement. And I read it as exactly a kind of, it's like propitiating power. I think that this figure is a kind of self-portrait of Deineka, and there he is with Kliment Varashilov, one of the commissars on the wall, who he was the patron saint of, not patron saint, he was the patron commissar of physical culture, as well as the person who signed the death orders for hundreds of military officers. So a very terrifying figure. And I end the chapter in an homage to my late husband, Robert Byrd, a scholar of Russian cinema and literature, who's written a book about Tarkovsky. And shortly before he died, we were watching the film Mirror by Tarkovsky, and I suddenly said, stop the tape. And if you see there on the right, is this oh yes, right here, that's this poster. And it's a scene from the movie where his mother, the figure of the main character's mother, is running in terror through the factory where she works because she thinks she might have transposed the letters of Stalin's name to make it into a swear word. And she's terrified. And here she is literally framed between Barashilov in the back and Deineka's poster on the wall. So that's my proof that it was an image of terror. And then I won't say much more. The end is just the afterword, the Soviet Picasso, and it's about how Deineka falls out of favor. I mean, he keeps falling in and out of favor, but he falls out of favor basically after 1948 and is only brought back into favor in 1957 when he's given a solo exhibition that everybody loves. And, you know, it's like, I don't know if there are dozens, but there are probably almost 20 reviews of this show. And I argue that he was chosen specifically to counteract Pablo Picasso, who had just had an exhibition in Moscow and Leningrad, much to the dismay of the Central Committee that had hoped to keep it small and contained. And it blossomed into this exhibition that excited all the young artists and everyone, and everybody was talking about it. And they thought, uh-oh, we better find an antidote, a homegrown antidote to this horrible modernist Picasso. Yes, he's a communist, but we don't like his pictures. And so I posit that Deineka was rehabilitated as he was called the Samый Современный, the most modern or the most contemporary of Soviet artists, and kind of retrieved as the model of Soviet modern art, which he remained until his death in 1969. So I'm going to stop talking. Thank you for listening.
Well, to start, I want to say how I feel very glad and very privileged to be able to be at this celebration of Christina's important new book. I suppose it goes without saying I'm a great admirer of the book, as I have been of other major works she's been carrying out over more than 30 years or so on the political pressures and the ideals driving and shaping post-revolutionary Soviet art. And I've been particularly drawn to the consistent commitment that set in once she began working on Deineka to overcome the rigid dichotomies drawn in Euro-American thinking about Soviet art and between an earlier experimental, radically modern avant-garde and a subsequent conservative realism consolidated under the rubric of dogmatic socialist realism instituted by a totalitarian Stalinist state. Rather windy, long-winded way of saying what Christina just said. Apologies for repeating it. I was struck by how many of the issues that developed grew out of and imaginatively connected with those adumbrated in her earlier study, the socialist objects of Russian constructivism. And I think this emerges most clearly in her focus in the Deineka book on the central role played by graphic production in the Earl of the Arts. His close involvement in its social processes of production and distribution, and its function as a public art appropriate to the modern age of mechanical reproduction and to a newly socialized Soviet world. The book, as you just heard, on Deineka begins with the artist's startling visualizing of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which he devised as a print for distribution in the, what I think, productivistically titled the Journal of Atheism at the Worth Bench. It's an amazing image, and it's wonderful to open the book and wham, this thing comes out at you. No apologia for dictatorship of the proletariat, there it is. There is no denying that a rarefied notion of socialist realism has dogged understandings of realist tendencies in post-revolutionary Soviet art. And this has mainly to do with negative connotations of the term, exemplifying the deleterious effect of totalitarian imposition on what should be free and experimental creation of art, to pick up on one of the cliches of this view. Alternatively, though, I think, if to a much lesser degree, the term has been clouded by romantic conceptions it seemed to offer to some on the left as an alternative, if imperfect, to the corrupted artistic productions of the capitalist West, this most strongly in the 1930s. It also emerges in a weird way, which I can't go into now, that wonderful film by Pasolini, La Rabia, where a group of Russians are shown being taken around an exhibition of socialist realist exhibitions. He's first enticed by it and then furious about it. It's a wonderful, wonderful term. Christina does not counter the negative reputation associated with socialist realism, nor does she seek to rescue the term. Rather, she sets such reifications to one side and seeks to reinterpret the actual work associated with this formation. Taking Deineka as a test case, she examines in exacting detail how he negotiated a practice of his own creation in response both to the inspirational ideals, revolutionary energy, and also the often imposed ideological imperatives of Soviet communism. So there's the two aspects there, a response to a kind of revolutionary enthusiasm, but also necessarily to aspects of an imposed ideology, which operates, I see, mainly on a political level, not on an artistic aesthetic level. Now, even in the latter circumstances, in the conditions of the more hierarchical Soviet state and eventually violent state in Stalin's years, she insists it was still artists who had to devise and make the art which came to be designated as socialist realism. Ideological imperatives could not in themselves produce it. It is refreshing to see how she also sets to one side, and I think this is very important, the usual weighing up of the degrees to which Soviet artists and cultural figures were either complicit in the system or dissenting from and resisting in it. This was, in practice, a largely false dichotomy for those living in and constantly responding to the pressures of this ideologically charged milieu. At least those with some initiative and strength, initiative and integrity, like Deineka, who were seeking to produce credible work within the ever-shifting constraints and possibilities their Soviet world offered them. Of course, during the purges, many did not manage to survive. At which point, any such considerations were rendered bitterly redundant. Christina's is an approach that has substantive and concretely anchored insights to offer into a key issue that, I say without exaggeration, saturates current retrospective assessments of social and political and cultural developments in post-revolutionary Russia. To what extent and how long did the vital revolutionary impulses of 1917 and 18 reproduce themselves and persist once Soviet state, supposedly institutionalizing communist principles, established itself? And at what moment were they beginning to be damagingly compromised and betrayed? Studies such as Christina's demonstrate how complex the situation could be, and it's insisting on a clear shift to a degenerate, hierarchical, oppressive, and rigidly centralized Stalinism from an earlier, more truly communist movement does not do justice to the situation, even if there is an underlying validity to the longer-term trajectory this implies. Revolutionary, radically egalitarian, generally socialist aspirations did persist in various, often paradoxical forms, even in the Stalin-dominated years. And I'm thinking particularly, for instance, of works like Platonov's Happy Moscow, this strange, eccentric, and very powerful work. Elements of vital artistic and literary debate did continue even after the forced dissolution of independent cultural organizations in 1932. I've had some fun working on Lukács, reading the great debates around the Soviet novel, and these are amazing debates. They were very open. They were closed down almost immediately. But at one moment, in 1933 to 4, they were open and very inventive. Hopes for the full emergence of a new radically socialist, non-capitalist, productive economy may have been eviscerated by the horrors and disasters of forced collectivization, but they were not entirely wiped out, with the latter, even on occasion, imagined as staged as a utopian pastoral. It's interesting how often one comes across works such as this, which seek to picture an ideal collectivity, not in the factory, but in a collectivized agricultural arena. Pastoral tradition lives on. She even provocatively traces a segment of Deineka's women's meeting on the front cover of her book, facing off the boldly capitalized collective body of the title. And one really wonders how the two connect. And that in that uncertainty, I think there lies a lot, which is really fascinating. In the discussion of the painting, it emerges as a deeply troubling conflation. On the one hand, envisioning an ideal, non-hierarchical female Soviet collectivity, and on the other, registering the reverberations of unspeakable trauma, an intermingling of dream and horror along the lines encapsulated in the German title of Karl Schlegel's celebrated study, Moscow, 1937. There is the further point of particular significance to me. Christina has come out with the first truly substantial treatment available in the Anglo-American world, now I was looking for them for some time, of one of the finest and most important artists of the 20th century. At least this is how I see the situation, though many may not agree now with such a designation of Deineka. And I must say, many of my friends were very skeptical about my tastes, but I did manage to persuade a small group to make the pilgrimage to Moscow in 2016 to see the big show at the Deineka at the Tretyakov, which everybody was. Actually, I was just thinking back to that self-portrait of Deineka that you showed. We were all horrified and terrified by it. Really dominated. I think you sort of hinted that in your account of the installation of the exhibition. Christina takes the story into the moment of extinction or near total extinction in 1937 to 8. And this is when she does this, there's a further particular point. Now, I was interested, I mean, I may be wrong in this, but I think the first significant Deineka monographic show was in 1982 outside Russia, in Stuttgart, but that sort of rather fell below the radar. It's 2011 where he really sprang into existence. There's a big show in Rome, but the main one was this wonderful show in Madrid, and I not so much, which I suspect you had a role because there was something of your book in the way it presented Deineka. It was an amazing show. Now, I just thought there's a personal reminiscence here, which sort of highlights the extent to which back in 2003, this very positive take on Deineka was rather eccentric. Because when I remember coming up to Christina after a talk she gave in 2003 at CAA, it was on Deineka. And I said, well, look, I really admire Deineka. I think he's a truly great artist. She was totally taken aback. She wondered what on earth had hit her, this sort of random bolt from the blue, because it was such an unexpected response. That this is happening. People might say this is interesting, but actually to say they really like the art, that was unusual. And this encounter, I hasten to add, possibly helped to consolidate what has become a long-term friendship. I shall finish now by honing in on two aspects of her analysis, which personally I found are responding to most strongly, in the course of which I shall pose a couple of questions. These relate to lines of thinking I was spurred into pursuing by her suggestive argumentation and critical observation, but which probably deviate slightly from what she herself had in mind. Firstly, there is the issue of how the freely engaged athletic body, invigorated by the formal discipline of Deineka's residual constructivism, became for him a primary medium for imagining a new collectively engaged proletarian body in the work of the 1930s. What makes the analysis that Christina offers in her book particularly productive is her foregrounding of the gender politics that emerged from his giving such primacy of place to the female body as possibly the most appropriate figure of a larger Soviet collectivity. This raises a question I have about the nature and significance of the shift from the more materialist laboring body of his work in the 1920s to the more perfectly formed body engaged in sport and physical culture in the 1930s. In the latter, as Christina argues, the affect becomes more lyrical rather than dense with material irregularities and imperfections of an actually existing reality that was cultivated in earlier realist work. And I think present too in Deineka's envisioning of the proletarian agent of revolutionary change in his work of the 1920s, which is the work I honestly find the most interesting. There's some sort of touch of realism here. In the latter, in this kind of work, the affinity with earlier realist fashionings of the proletarian figure can at times be very direct, as when Deineka drew so obviously on an established late realist figuration of the coal miner, which was pioneered by the Belgian artist Constantin Meunier, known for bringing the proletarian body into the field of high art. So it is this somewhat the lingering naturalist, realist aspect of these 1920s works, which I'm wondering about what's at stake when you shift from that image of the collective body to the perfectly formed product of sport and physical culture, which you find in the work of the 30s. And there's a slight parallel, I think, there in the shift in Rodchenko's photography between the 1920s and 30s. Now, to end these considerations, I want briefly to turn to Deineka's striking painting of female textile workers. This work does not fit readily into the category either of a more conventional, evidently proletarian body or of an imagined cultured body free from the grinding demands of hard labor and material necessity, a liberation that communism supposedly would make possible and was perhaps beginning to make possible. At one level, it projects the utopian image of a perfectly functioning, streamlined modern factory workplace as the figuration of a broader social collectivity that might come into being in a newly invigorated socialist world. At another, it registers something of the realities of actual physical factory labour, of the workers' subjection to strict discipline of the body and the mind required by working processes. Most fully evident, I think, as Christina points out, in the foreground figures thoroughly absorptive attentiveness to the intricacies of her labouring. This is disciplined labour. This is not freely activated human bodies. There is a world of difference, politically and aesthetically, between this and the image of female collectivity projected in the later at the women's meeting. The latter says a lot about both what Stalinism had done to socialist realism and Soviet society by the later 1930s, and about what Deineka, I'm afraid, took from and made of such fantasies of collectivities at this later threatened stage of his career. I mean, he was under threat, like almost everybody in Moscow at that time was worried that he might be dragged off into prison or somebody executed at any moment. This leads me to a second and final question about the nature of the pictorial affect operating in David Mecker's work, both in the 20s and in the 30s. Such affect, as Christina argues, is in part about a work's reaching out to and drawing in the viewer emotionally. As such, it is in some ways about the rhetorical embellishment of a work's legible social content. There is a further dimension to such affect, however, the operating with subtleties of pictorializing, which I would say are found in Deineka's female textile workers, including such things as the bare feet, have a resonant social content that cannot entirely be encapsulated analytically or by way of a close iconographical reading of the work. This content could be described as an affective pictorial fabric, dense with material complexities that do not evade or escape understanding in a fashionable, characteristically deconstructive way, but rather cannot be exhaustively articulated within it. This is a matter of a possible substantive content of pictorial affect, rather as distinct from its straightforward, emotionally charged effect. In this case, I build on, while also slightly departing from Christina's last case, from Christina's illuminating analysis of this curious work, Conversation of the Collective Farm Brigade of 1934. This was work located historically at the fulcrum of early Soviet debate around socialist realism, as well as a largely disavowed living out in metropolitan circles of the consequences of the forced collectivization of agriculture. I mean, to make this image had to be credible in some respect. This is not something that you would, So, the work stages literally and metaphorically the imagined socialist collective of a collective farm brigade negotiating the workings of the farm under its care. It is far from being a picture of an actually existing reality. Theatrical and slightly artificial platforming of the group and the work's element of modernist flattening and compositional stylization, as Christina points out, makes this evident to those alert to such effects as being more than mere formalist reduction. There is, though, a further complexity to the work's devising beyond its combining of realist representation with the projective and utopian force of an underlying constructive organizing of pictorial space. I'm thinking of the undercurrents produced by the naturalistic characterization of individual figures, even as they are incorporated in the democratic or egalitarian array. There is, I think, the evident paternalism emanating from the older man leading the discussion. there is also the contrast that emerges once you look closely between the lively attentiveness to the proceedings of the two young women on the right and the varying degrees of boredom, disconnection, or mere fatigue obliquely registered by the expressions and bodily dispositions of several of the older, more traditionally dressed figures on the right. Here, something might be emerging of Deineka's awareness of more mundane social realities masked by the regime's ideological celebration of collectivization, which he was also serving in this sketch for a newly fully realized official position of sex.
So thank you so much for the incredible, first of all, introduction to the book by Christina and to the remarks by Alex Fox, which raised already a number of questions. So without further ado, we're going to have some short remarks, maybe with a question posed towards Christina first from Sarah Wilson and then Michał Murawski, and we will try to keep them short.
Yes,
So we have time for your questions.
Collective audience of choice keep them short.
Yeah. First of all, of course, congratulations to Christina. It's a really marvellous book. I've got it in my hands, close to my breast, and I hope you'll sign it for me. And to introduce me in my relationship to the subject matter capacity. I first went to the Soviet Union in '81 and last in 1919. We're going to talk about Freud in a moment. 2022, of course. In fact, we both went together, and it was just so close to the
December
2021, just so close to the
yeah.
we were all there together. So it was a very long trajectory, and in fact the first PhD I supervised on Soviet issues was about the relationship between the Soviet industrial and economic body to the sporting body by Michael O'Mahony, who's now Professor of Soviet Art in Bristol. So I went through all those things, and I did have the excitement of seeing the great big Deineka retrospective at the Tretiakov. I'd always loved his work. I always was so excited seeing the defense of Petrograd and thinking of Eisenstein's staging of the October Revolution with those walking figures. I was very happy that his Soviet female bodies were quite large female bodies and not skinny female bodies. This is my quickie. So it was wonderful to come to this serious study. And it's interesting that whereas one could frame the trajectory in one way by the defense of Petrograd and then the Battle of Stalingrad, which I love very much incidentally, and is a great double-page illustration towards the end of your book.
Sebastopol.
Sebastopol.
So you said Stalingrad, I was like, oh, have I missed an
I'm
important
very in
painting?
Freudian mode tonight, the defense of Sebastopol, which I think is a tremendous, I wish I got it here to show you. Actually, the double Picasso relates, of course, to my own concerns, because right at the very beginning of I first went to the Soviet Union with the Pompidou Center personnel, and this was when I was thrust, unbeknownst to me, how life-changing it was going to be, into the question of French socialist realism and Franco-Soviet relationships. And so this double whammy of Picasso in '37 relating to Deineka and Picasso in 1956 in the Soviet Union, this exhibition of his 80th birthday, and the sort of way that you positioned Deineka was for me very, very interesting. The next thing I found extremely, these are just like Sarah's highlights, which we haven't talked about yet, was the visit to Philadelphia in 1934, which was so strange. Not only did some things look like Josephine Baker albums, of course you discuss it politically as well, but when you came to the incredible painting, you saw boredom there, and you discovered, of course, it was the portrait of Martha, is it Spicer? Who's the daughter of the rich lawyer who daughter-in-law who first So sort of Deineka's first great big capitalist interior. I liked your phrase of him being an American ethnographer. It actually reminded me so very vividly of, in fact, what was going on in France. I remembered Jean Clair's big exhibition of 1981, Les Réalismes, because, in fact, not only the realism of the bourgeois woman, but the boredom of bourgeois women, not only in Balthus, but even more specifically in Francis Gruber, is entirely similar. Of course, what I really like is the paint in Deineka. Nobody's actually said what a magnificent colorist he is here. And so the fact that there were these things going on exactly in parallel in Italy and also in France, the idea of this idea not only of boredom, but Jean Clair, of course, talks about accidiae and the trope of melancholia going all through the 20s and 30s. For me, was very interesting with this particular image. What was my, wait a second, there was one more thing I wanted to mention. And then in the women's meeting, not only this dialectical reading of what was going on, obscene, off-scene, I thought was amazing, but actually your deep Freudianism in actually reproducing Freud's Wolfman, who of course was Russian. And yet, something that people haven't mentioned, the thing that I thought was so interesting as an art historian is when one looks at paintings and one actually thinks of sources, they always, if you like, surge up in our subconscious. And while I knew about the Parthenon friezes in Fougeron, I thought, what's that? And then you discovered, I don't mean you discovered, but you analysed it. Of course, it was Skopos's Battle of the Amazons, and these were women directed by a kind of Amazonian matriarchy, I think you said. The thing that was amazing was actually relating this with an illustration to Piero della Francesca's flagellation of Christ.
It was this moment when I felt like a real art historian.
Yes, a brilliant art historian, with the neoclassical pillars, with the receding perspective, with something rather nasty going on, almost so far away we can't see it in the Piero della Francesca. But those pastel colours, this was what was going on in my subconscious, and I saw the illustration, and I said, oh yes, Christina, brilliant art historian. And actually, in Alex's last illustration, those farmers, those were all those pastel colours, like apostles in a row, with the Madonna figure on the left, and that idea of him being haunted by what at 19 years old he called visionaries, the artists who should be saved from history, was also very, very wonderful. And so there's so many great things in this book, but I think we want to accelerate. But your art historical brilliance, Christina, and that particular moment where Freud meets Piero della Francesca and zooms through the beautiful colours of thing in this very beautifully designed book. I mean, this pink stripe, which picks it up, very well designed. Thank you, Christina, for your book.
Thank you.
Thank you also, and yeah, I mean, it really is a wonderful book, and I'm all the more humbled to be speaking about it very briefly, trust me, as a non-proper art historian, or not even pretending to be an art historian. So my presence here is rather rogue. Nevertheless, I think it is a beautiful book. It is a kind of, it's
Can
a
I just
even,
say that Michał is an anthropologist of architecture?
whatever that means. The book is very beautiful, and it's also very, even though it's written over decades, it's still very whole and it's very total. And I due to an extremely long PhD thesis on the Soviet mass housing system that I had to read and turned out to be about 3 times longer than expected, I wasn't able to finish the whole book, and I feel this kind of pain that I wasn't able to experience this collective body in its totality. So I'm going to leave early and try to finish the book tonight. But I do encourage you to get the object and to really sort of treat it as a whole, because it does fit together extremely well as a system. And as a very tightly woven, theoretically and intellectually sophisticated edifice, which clearly has developed over a very long period of thinking systematically about not just art, but about the context which it exists in. But I wanted to quickly ask you to comment a little bit more on whether there's any place for the kind of word that you added to, if there's time, the word that you added to the title of your book for the conference that you organized, at which me and Masha spoke back in 22, which you called The Collective Body Dismembered. And looking at this book again and thinking about dismemberment and thinking about the overdetermination of any work of Russian or Soviet, any discipline, anything, by war at the moment, what space is there for thinking about dismemberment in the context of Deineka? And of course, the Sevastopol, Battle of Sevastopol was just mentioned, and there's a few kind of small cuts in there, and some damaged buildings and some planes flying around, but it's not particularly gory. There's no arms cut off, or there's no huge.
There's some blood.
There's some blood, but there's sort of surface wounds. The body's even there. I suppose it's what the canon of the time demands, but nevertheless, he still feels a compulsion to represent those bodies as extremely whole. So, is there a space in Deineka for more dismemberment? And we've been thinking about this with Sarah too, because I'm preparing this book on the Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw, at the center of which will stand the socialist realist sculpture by Alina Szapocznikow, which used to stand in the Palace of Culture. Yeah, I mean, they're sort of lying on the ground, chilling. Nobody's really...
Exactly.
No, I think it's tremendous.
It's tremendous, but there's not, the bodies are still absolutely untarnished. So can we, and we're interested in this, in the conversations I've had with Sarah about this monument. We've kind of talked about the fact that it can stand in the palace, in the new museum across the road from the Palace of Culture. We can get away with having it there partly because the arms have been cut off and it's dismembered, and it makes this Polish-Soviet friendship that it's supposed to represent more palatable and more critical and more radical somehow. Whereas the fact that Deineka is undismemberable does it make him less rememberable? Do we have to, does it tarnish him in some way? So that leads on to the final question, I suppose, which is, which Deineka should we remember? And how can we remember Deineka without dismembering him? Or do we need to go and attack his paintings in order to be able to remember him in a more progressive way or in a more generative way? And as I was thinking about that, I also was really enjoying your footnotes on his Ukrainianness, which is a thought that had crossed my mind before, but I hadn't really properly investigated it until looking through your book, and the fact that Deineka comes from Deineko, right, which comes from the Ukrainian Deineyaki, which is kind of like a person who's de facto from nowhere in particular, right? Deineyaki, from nowhere really important, which is picked on by the Soviet critics as a kind of, and it's in an attempt to proletarianize him, to make it seem like he's from some kind of Cossack outcast, untouchable social group. But it's pretty interesting that he has this name, Deineka, Deineyaki, which also made me think of the Ukrainian Soviet, the Ukrainian collective Deinede, which is an art collective which deals with Soviet monumental sculpture and art and painting, and its remainders in the Ukrainian landscape of culture, and it's increasingly dismembered remainders. But they persist in their commitment to the idea that nevertheless, Radianskie Cenie Sowieckie, Radianskie Cenie Ruskie, the Soviet does not necessarily mean Russian.
Right.
And we can still treat aspects of this legacy as part of a Ukrainian sovereign material culture, de facto. So just there's an overlap between the argument that you make about Deineka's relevance, between his name and between the project that Deinede is carrying out in attempting to kind of salvage aspects, to still argue for salvaging certain aspects of the Soviet material visual legacy in Ukraine for the purposes of the Ukraine that's resisting Russia and fighting and will emerge victorious from the ashes, while Russia will hopefully be dismembered and disintegrated.
Great.
So what is this? What is the Deineka that has to be remembered, that we can potentially remember? And this also, both in Dene and perhaps in this genre, in this gesture of trying to proletarianize Deineka, there is an emphasis on his universality as being, or on universality precisely as being from nowhere, right? So Dene, it's universal because it's not from Russia, it's not from anywhere in particular. And Deineka perhaps is universal because he's Deniaki, because he's from nowhere in particular. So maybe, perhaps this universality through nothingness is one way to capture this kind of progressive essence in Deineka. But I just realized I've inadvertently answered my question to you and rendered what was supposed to be a dismembered articulation much more whole than intended. But if you have any comments about that, then that would be good. And my last comment, which I won't ask, was about the market and why he sells so well. But that's probably connected to all of the above as well.
Just this one point on dismemberment. There are some very strange late paintings of bodies about to be dismembered, including the horrific Battle of the Amazons.
Right,
And which is sort of hinted at in the Scopas, which is before dismembered. And there are moments like the Nazi pilot falling from the sky where the body is about. And I think those Aryan bodies in the Battle of Sebastopol are about to be pierced by those bayonets as well. So there's an odd way that you've got the perfect body and then this absolute opposite, which hasn't occurred in the picture, but is suggested by it.
That's really interesting.
Christina, would you like to take a moment to answer?
I'll say a few things, but then I want to open it up to we want to open it up to the audience. So thank you for all of your extensive comments. It's so exciting that this book has been in process for so long. So the fact that people are reading it is still extraordinary to me, and it makes me really happy. So thank you so much. Just to maybe clarify some of Michał's remarks, because it went a little fast, but in 2022, I organized with a colleague in Copenhagen a conference called The Collective Body Dismembered, which was a direct response to the invasion of Ukraine. It was May 31st, 2022, so almost exactly 2 years ago, where we did bring displaced Ukrainian artists. That was part of the purpose of it, was just to kind of try to support them. And Ukrainian scholars, Katya Denisova was there, among others. But it was precisely this idea of my interest in the collective body and thinking about how there was a collective Soviet body, and that I was seeing Russia's invasion of Ukraine as a kind of definitive kind of slicing off of that and saying we've let go of that model of collectivity and now it's become an imperialist invasion. And the image on the poster was this Polish sculpture, right, of two brothers, or I forget what
I think it was supposedly called Polish-Soviet friendship. So
it was like Polish-Soviet
that was the
friendship.
original question.
And it's this very striking sculpture where the arms are gone. so that's just the image. I have it, but I don't have it in a PowerPoint right now. And so before answering some of the questions, I would just say I didn't get to in my PowerPoint, I forgot, but I just wanted to say that the beginning of my acknowledgements, they're somewhat portentous, I understand, but actually I say that my primary thanks goes to history itself, because I realized just with the timing, that I first went to the ex-Soviet Union. Well, that's not true. My first trip to this, so I'm not as cool as you, but my first trip was in 1984. So I got to spend the summer under actually existing socialism, under Chernenka, in 1984. But my first research trip was in 1992, and the invasion took place in 2022. And I just realized that, it's not important in the infinite scale of war, but that my entire career, such as it is, was authorized by this window that we didn't know was a window, right? That the Soviet Union came to an end, making archival research and archival access and everything so much easier. And I feel like we just kind of, sang in our chains like the sea, and it seemed like it would go on forever. And then it came to a grinding halt in 2022, and then now those of us who work on it are just completely reconfiguring our research because it's over being able to go there and even wanting to write this history. And I should say that, I mean, people knew that it was coming, and my friends told me, that it was coming, but I think it was hard to understand from the outside. I mean, obviously, I should have listened to them more, but I just wanted to acknowledge that, and just to say that it is strange to have this book come out at this moment, sort of a big monograph on a Russian artist, and that's some of what I'm kind of trying to work with, and Michal's comments speak to that. Deineka, so his last name is Ukrainian. He's born in Kursk, which is close to Ukraine. It is a Russian family, and actually it was his grandfather who Russified the name, so Deineko becomes Deineka. And there has been at least one scholarly effort to retrieve him as a Ukrainian nationalist, which just unfortunately, I think is wrong-headed. Because he was so profoundly Soviet, and so he was a big fan of Ukraine, of Crimea. He didn't go to there's not much about the Central Asian republics in his oeuvre, but just, in my view, he's not a Ukrainian nationalist, but that doesn't mean that we can't think creatively about what he's doing and, sort of the collective body and its dismemberment or not. My personal jaundiced view of his body is that it's the collective body that he's inventing in the 20s and 30s is, to me, obviously profoundly interesting, and I think a kind of a liberatory model, a socialist model, one that really does bear a lot of, I think, unconscious, unintended feminism, and is to me a real, I think you used a great word, I find it credible. I like that word. And that in the post-war, yes, I mean, you've all pointed out that there are these bodies that are about to be pierced. This painting, The Amazons from 1947, is so horrifying to me that it's illustrated obliquely in my preface in a photograph that I took at this retrospective exhibition, and I specifically did not want to illustrate it any further. It's like that feminist art project. Who's the feminist artist whose project was to invite everyone to a Marilyn Monroe film? This was, I think, in like 1972 or maybe 1980. It was a big performance where everybody was invited to a screening of a Marilyn Monroe film, and she refused to show it because it was so sexist. And so this battle of the, I see it's right there. And so I only wanted to illustrate it in the tiniest way because it's this kind of horrific cheesecake, kind of soft-core, violent porn image.
But you describe it so vividly with words that it makes the reader very much use Google.
I mean, firstly, you say unconscious feminism, but why can't you give him some credit for conscious feminism? A, and B, what I really like, I just must give you this little quote. This was so beautiful, I didn't say it when I was talking. When you were talking about this, you said the berserk proliferation of hyper-feminized women. And berserk is for when Vikings jump out of their, underground caves and go completely crazy and cut everybody up, in fact. So I thought it was so amazing, apropos of unconscious, you're unconscious, that you chose berserk proliferation.
Being a Viking origins myself, I didn't even know that.
So, I mean, I can't see why one couldn't give him credit for
I
real
do give him
feminism.
credit.
It's like real socialism.
What I say is I think that we could not expect any kind of theorized feminist position of someone, given who he was.
Not in that
Actually existing feminism, like you said.
Yeah,
Yeah, but that I say that he's a conductor, like an electrical conductor of a certain kind of socialist feminism. And so I do actually posit him as a feminist, but not.
He's still got to conceive and compose.
No, just not as a kind of card carrying, I suppose.
Okay.
But no, it's an argument that it is a feminist argument there.
So I think if that's okay at this point, I'm going to open up to the audience, and maybe we can take 3 questions. straight in order, because we want to finish at 1:45.
So that we can drink.
Yeah, exactly.
We might want to talk too, yeah.
So, Ruben, if we can.
Thanks. So it sounds amazing, the book. I can't wait to try and get a copy. But I was thinking about the representation of bodies, of female bodies, and then also how that relates to the male body. Because when I think of Deineka, it's not just about the female nude and these specific Soviet female women, the depictions of them, but also of the male body. I was thinking of the painting of the scene of the shower, which I think is quite a famous one as well, which is also notable that it really is a nude scene in the shower, male scene in the shower. And maybe you could say just a little bit more about the aspect of nudity of being clothed and unclothed, and also the significance of the male nude for Deineka, especially you open your presentation with his self-portrait, which is an extraordinary. Would you go towards homoerotic or is how do you relate to those kind of ideas which you can't help thinking about, or is that a kind of anachronistic reading of those images as well? Of these male nudes from that period, and other terms also might be better, like homosocial and this kind of like brotherly, comradely thing. But could you speak a little to this gender aspect from the sort of male homoerotic side as well?
We just take one more. The question was my question just in front? Yeah.
Just on the question of feminism, I was wondering how you responded to Susan Reed's reading of the Women with the Fish from the 50s, where she really stresses a kind of, in the context of the Thaw, a kind of him inviting objectifying male gaze, or the women's body as workers is kind of like a flimsy excuse for some kind of eroticism or something.
And we'll take one more question. Does anyone else have a question? Okay, I think.
Surely someone must. Why don't I answer those two and we'll see where we get. I mean, but they're all kind of related. I mean, I think, Ruben, your question is sort of about the queerness of Deineka, and this is something that when I started out working on him, being the product of 90s graduate school and the beginning of queer studies, I just completely assumed that he was queer. Just from my happy Berkeley stance, sitting in Berkeley, like, oh, this is so interesting, this queer artist. And then I just became much more familiar with just how complex that is within Russian culture, and the kind of homosociality, the possibility of what one would call in the West homosexual encounters that then do not necessarily lead to something that we would call homosexuality. I'm familiar with the kind of scant but growing histories of homosexuality in the Soviet Union, and I think if you're just asking sort of my sort of homemade analysis, I think that probably he was, from what I've learned as much as I can, I think almost more sort of asexual than anything really. He had relationships with women, but I don't know, that's a longer conversation we can have. But thinking about that there is there are these famous quotes from late Soviet writers, in particular a poet, I'm forgetting his name right now, who talks about how important Deineka's images were for him growing up, because he saw them as these homoerotic images that kind of confirmed his own nascent identity that he couldn't articulate. So I think the images have played that role. The painting you asked about, After the Shower, which was what he named it in 1944 in a kind of wartime way, is of these images of men seen from behind showering. And I illustrate in my book a really great image of young men showering. I don't know if I can find it quickly enough. Yes, you can't see it, but there's a line of 3 naked young men showering, which was in the journal Dayosh. And I talk about it as this kind of hyper-embodied, sexualized imagery in the middle of this Oktyabr kind of workers' magazine where there's nothing else like this. But the painting after the battle is quite famously based on a photograph by, I'm having a senior moment, one of the famous documentary photographers. You can Google it while I talk. Who is it? It's not Rodchenko, but it's one of his colleagues. And so he makes this painting, and I remember seeing the painting in 2019 in St. Petersburg at the Deineka Samokhalov exhibition with a friend of mine who was in his 60s, an older ex-Soviet person, and he's like, what kind of after the battle? Where were there showers after the battle? There's no edifice with showers with hot water. But anyway, I think it's interesting because he's so known for some of these images of male bodies, and you brought that up as well, that I ended up concentrating on the female bodies, but I think the preponderance actually ends up being female bodies, but the male bodies are so striking to us because they're really quite rare, also kind of in the history of modern art, except for sort of, very well-known exceptions. And I think that the whole nudity thing is interesting in that when he made his nude paintings that critics responded to as lyrical, this was in 1932-33, which are the paintings of Lucia Ftorova, the swimmer, that was completely shocking. There were no images of nudes. Soviet visual culture was extremely chaste. And I talk about this at some length. That in 1926, Pyotr Sokolovskaya made a nude painting, and the critics were so angry at him. They're saying, what is this Western Boulevard panopticon image of the naked woman? And so when he did the nude bodies, it was as if he could get away with it because of the reputation he had established as a graphic artist and as this impeccably socialist artist. And the critics then responded and said, basically, it's okay that they're nudes because they're so socialist. And this is not the objectification of women. This is not the piquant eroticism of Renoir and so on. And so to answer your question, getting to after the war, basically my thesis is that very powerful, we can discuss whether conscious or not, feminism of his work really disappears after World War II. And I totally agree with Susan Reed. You have the Battle of the Amazons, you have all these fulsome women with these erect nipples pushing against thin fabric and so on. And there's a huge nude from, I think, 1952 called Bather, which is so incredibly salacious. And I talk in the preface about how Mayor Lushkov went to see the Deineka retrospective in 2009, and he took one look around, he zeroed in on that painting, and then set up in front of it with the TV cameras on him. So just kind of this sort of embrace of this completely standard objectification of women. And I would connect it to the repression, not repression, but the way in which Deineka fell out of favor. I actually see it as a kind of reaction formation, a kind of masculine reaction formation, that the kind of power over the female body. And you see fewer male bodies. There's one showering male body from 1952 or 53, which I don't know, it's like some kind of Norman Rockwell on crack kind of muscular. It's I guess I just bracket that as part of a very different formation, both in relation to his public and in relation to his own sense of what he's doing, than the pre-war work. So I don't know if I really answered your questions, but thank you for giving me an opportunity to talk about these ideas.
Great, thank you. Maybe we have time for one more question. Genius?
Just
Oh, hi, Denise. I knew I was recognizing you.
just to follow up actually a bit on that question, could that be also that Deineka was interested in classics in some way? Because also the explanation of those maybe images that appear queer could be actually his celebration of what you could have seen in a Hermitage Museum collection, for example, that hypermasculinity, even the image that you showed, the showering, basically, you could imagine, and there are actually, I think, in the Hermitage Museum, a couple of sculptures that show, for example, the Spartans using strigil to clean themselves, sort of, in a way.
Yes.
It just came into my mind while the question was asked, and I wonder if, and as well as even the subjects of the paintings that were named, the Battle of the Amazons, the the friezes sort of in the building. So maybe there could be something line of him as well, looking at the classical Greek culture as something, or even collectivist nature of the ancient Greek culture. Sparta, for example, per se, it was a collective body in a way. It's something that Soviet Union could be an embodiment in that present, something like that. Just your thoughts on
And
that.
of course, there are games of the Spartacus, aren't there? The
Yeah.
Olympic Games in
Yeah, it's exactly
Soviet
the
Union, called the Spartakiads.
Spartakiada, right, exactly. No, you're absolutely right, Denise, there are moments when I talk about this. So in a way, I've shied away a little bit from the classicism interpretation, because that's one that is an existing one of him. And so I really, in every case, wanted to bring it more toward a kind of deep history of the kind of socialist force field in which he was working. But you're absolutely right. And, it's not like in the collective body with the Skopa sculpture there, we would say, ni slučajna, that there's this classical model. He writes, when he publishes Little Things in the 1930s, he emphasizes his love of Skopas and his love of Greek sculpture. And I think that that's right. I don't doubt it, but it's also not an innocent thing to say, because it's also a kind of cover. I mean, it also gives him cover for the nude bodies and so on, because I think, Soviet art critics, if you could connect it to this good model, or something like Piero della Francesca, the Italian primitives were A-okay, they were good. And so especially at the moment of the terror, connecting his work to these unassailable models was also a cover if critics were to come back and say something about it. But I do think, of course he was trained. He wasn't, because he went to Vchutemas, so that was a radical art school where they specifically were not studying the Greeks, but he did it himself. There's a quite hilarious film from 1961, I believe, where they're in his studio and he's taking on the role of the august academician of the late Soviet era, wearing, a nice shirt, and he shows to the camera his art albums and his Italian Renaissance albums and his Greek sculpture albums. So there's this kind of dialectic back and forth between it being what an important artist does, and then of probably having been a real inspiration to him, because he was known as the body guy. That everyone said that about him, all the critics. He's our artist who shows this new Soviet body, the kind of telesness and so on. And so I think yes, you're absolutely right that the classicism is there. And the critic Abram Efros writes about his lyrical paintings and talks about the antique chastity of their appearance, but then immediately pulls it toward the Soviet, right? So it's always, it can be there, but it then gets articulated as a fizkulturnica rather than a Greek goddess, right? So thank you for that.
Maybe as the chair, just take one moment to bring it from the classical to the most contemporary of contemporary artists that he was called in 1957. Did he, we talked about him primarily as a painter, and you obviously emphasized him being a mass graphic artist to start with. So it's interesting, in historiography, primarily he's discussed as a painter, and we do see and kind of fetishize his big paintings. And as a contemporary artist and being part of October, a very basic question. Did he take any photographs? Was he interested in the moving image? Just
Very, very little. I found some source photographs in various kind of private archives, but he didn't take them. And when he went to the US in 34, 35, he was there for about 2.5 months, he brought a sketchbook, lots of sketchbooks. He was like a European artist on the grand tour.
Oh yeah, he did go to Italy.
And he did go to Italy and he made sketches. And it's so weird because why didn't he just take photographs? You know, that's what he did.
He did exactly the same.
Yeah.
He was absolutely violently anti the idea of a camera.
Well, I don't think Deineka was specifically anti-photographic, but it just wasn't something that he was doing. And not a
Even
lot.
his posters are so kind of figurative and wholesome in that sense. They're not kind of in any way dismembered through photomontage or...
Right, I mean, I do discuss in his images for...
In your thing, the photographic vulgarity of aging and disgusting life.
Who said that?
Deineka in 1918, Art of Our Days.
Oh, right, yes. Well, but yeah, he said a lot of things in 1918. That was what I was reading from. Yes, that's true. In fact, he worked, now, I'm sorry, I'm just remembering this. He had a job in 1918 in Kursk as a police photographer taking mugshots.
There we go.
So there you have it. He just repressed that, I think. Yeah. That was like a bad beginning.
That's a good exhibition, isn't it? These mugshots, except maybe if Kursk gets taken by the Ukrainian army, which is
Then we can go to Kursk.
archives.
Yeah. But wait, I want to, this is, there isn't any, he rarely talks about film, unfortunately. I mean, because it would be interesting to hear about that. But as you may have noticed in the installation photograph from his 1957 exhibition, after the war, he starts making sculptures. And they're these incredibly realistic little sculptures. And I see that as him, like literally manipulating and manhandling this collective body. It becomes a kind of possession for him, as opposed to earlier when it was this kind of public-facing image that he was imagining this new kind of politically collectivized body. It becomes these privatized sports figures that you can just kind of see the traces of his hands on. Yeah, so thank you for that.
So before drinks, which are going to be next door, please join me in thanking Christina and all the guests.